worked on my first grant, I had never received training on how to write a grant. And somebody was like, oh, we gotta submit this to a funder, so we need you to write such and such. And I'm like, wait, what? And then I ended up working in philanthropy, and I had no idea how it worked. I had no idea what the rules were. And so it is my personal mission to demystify what happens on the other side of the table. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm going to share some slides that I can have Brandy send out later. I will not be able to do slides and monitor the chat. So Brandy or Danielle, if you need to interrupt me for questions, please feel free to do that. I want this to be interactive. I want your questions to be answered. I also do not intend to be trite. So if you know certain information, just work with me, because I'm coming from the perspective that there may be folks that don't know all the things. So I'm gonna say that, and then I'm just gonna put out there that I am always me. And so I'm gonna give it to you straight. And I hope that this time together will be fruitful. So let's see if me and Zoom are gonna get along today. Does anyone see a slide?
So far, so good. We see slides.
All right, we are rocking and rolling. As Brandy mentioned it briefly, this is Black Philanthropy Month. This is also Black August, which means this to me is the blackity months you will have in our country in terms of Black folks leading a conversation about what does it mean for us to work towards our liberation. Philanthropy is not going to get us free, but philanthropy is a tool that we can use on our freedom journey. And so we're going to get into it. If you find knowledge that is helpful and informational that you want to share out, I encourage you to use the Black Philanthropy Month hashtag so that the knowledge that you're learning, we can share out to the broader community. All right, so I learned this, I think my first day working at the foundation. I work at the Simmons Foundation here in Houston. If you've met one funder, you've met one funder. When someone told me that, I was like, I don't even understand what that means. And I know many of you who've tried or are actively applying for grants are understanding what I'm talking about. Every foundation has a different process, different guidelines. We have different databases. We have different strategic visions. And so it really is for every foundation that you're interacting with, every donor that you're interacting with, you're having to cater to their needs, even though, in my opinion, we should be doing the reverse. We should be catering to the needs of the community. But that's not how my industry is set up. And I will add that while I know that things need to change, it's not going to happen without leadership. And that includes y'all's leadership and or legislative advocacy to make our sector be different. And so I want you to hold that as I go through the slide deck. I also want to hold that there's more to philanthropy than grants. And so I'm going to get into some of those vehicles. And then finally, I would say that traditional, more mainstream philanthropy is still, particularly in Houston, very much rooted in charity mindset. And that I believe, and many of my peers believe, that the philanthropy of the future is going to be rooted in liberation and self-determination. And so that's going to mean a different way of moving money and talking about power in the context of philanthropy. So I say this publicly in other places, so I will say it public to you. My industry is made up. It is a completely arbitrarily developed field. And so I often say philanthropy is fake. And I say that in jest, but also in seriousness, in that anything that we do, or most of what we do, we can change. And so as you're thinking about your call to action, I want you to hold that change is possible if folks are organized and organized around helping my industry change. So the IRS has some basic things that it requires of us. One is that we spend 5% of our corpus, which is basically the investment income that we have. So what's in our bank account, if you will. We're not allowed to do what's called self-dealing. So we can't like generate business for donors. We can't get like free office space. So there are some guidelines that it's not supposed to be for the self-interest of the person who is the donor. For private foundations, I will also say that, the IRS says on their website something like they're stringently monitored and that they're taxed. Well, the excise tax for foundations is 1.39%. Now, as a middle class person who always is on a payment plan with Uncle Sam, I find this hilarious. But this is the system that we are working in. Foundations, some foundations do raise money from outsiders because it is allowed, as long as, again, it's not self-dealing. They have to file a 990. Private foundations are connected to the source of the funding. So you can have a foundation like mine that has a living donor. You could have a foundation like the Powell Foundation, which is a family foundation, meaning their family is very active, either in staff and or board. You can have a corporate foundation. There are lots of different types of foundations that will be underneath the private foundations. In Houston, it's most common for us to have family foundations or private foundations. Those are the kind of big buckets. Houston Endowment is a private foundation. Our governance is that we have bylaws and we have a board of directors, but there's no public accountability on what that looks like. Those are set by, usually by the donor or the group of folks who have started the foundation. We do have some limits on lobbying, though we can do advocacy and we can communicate with the executive branch. So for example, at my foundation, we have written letters to the federal government around policies that will impact us here in Houston. So that is possible. And then we can give out grants. We can give out scholarships. We used to have a scholarship fund. We can provide loans. We can guarantee loans. There are lots of ways. And so if the only exposure you've had to private foundation is a grant, I just want to open up this whole world in that there are other ways that private foundations can function and that you can be in conversation about what you want to see them doing in the future. I do want to tease out that there is a difference between a private foundation and a community foundation. So our local community foundation is the Greater Houston Community Foundation, which I'm sure a lot of y'all are familiar with based on their website that they launched last year. We also have some statewide foundations. So the Texas Women's Foundation used to be the Dallas Women's Foundation, is now a statewide foundation that focuses on women and girls. So if you're doing work that is particular and specific to women and girls, they might be a community foundation you want to be thinking about and engaging with. A community foundation is a private charity, a public charity, like many of your nonprofits. That means that the majority of its money comes from the public, okay? So just like other traditional social service organizations, they raise their money. They must, like you must, and if you don't know this, we can have a different conversation later, you have to pass a public support test. And that means that a third of your income has to come from contributions from the public. And that IRS looks at that over a 5-year period. So when they ask you to list your donors and like where you're getting your grants from, that's why, because there is a public support test that public charities must meet. And so the same exists for our community foundation. They raise their money from individuals. They raise their money from families. They raise their money from businesses. And so it is an interesting setup at a community foundation and how they function. They're out there doing what you do, trying to get resources into their corpus so that they can generate more resources, hopefully, but not always, for the better of the community. And so community foundation model has been around for a very long time. And their models look a little bit different, but when you donate to a community foundation, you are getting tax deductions. Individuals in Houston, and I'm speaking for our context, that give to community foundation are often high net worth individuals who want to park their money somewhere. Because if you set up, and I'm going to talk and get in the weeds in a little bit, a donor advised fund, or if you have a family foundation that you want a community foundation to administer, those things are tax write-offs. So they're not sitting in your bank account where you are having to pay taxes on it. So you can put that into different vehicles that community foundations host. Community foundations re-grant out into local communities. They do not have a payout requirement. So you can open an account there and it could sit there and not actually come out into the community. And so that's something that we can talk about. There are lots of opinions about Should that be so, and what that means for local communities, which most community foundations focus on their region in terms of where they do their grants. They also have a board, and many would say that community foundations are also influenced by their donors because that's their book of business, the individuals who put their money there. And so some people might ask why certain community foundations do or do not do certain work. It might be based on the interest of donors or their board. And so those are things to think about. Just like I have a living donor and a board of directors who's guiding what our strategic direction is, they too have influences about the things that they fund. And I'm about to get into the weeds in a second, but again, the community foundations host donor advised funds. They host pooled funds, fields of interest, giving circles, and I'm gonna walk through what those are. Are there questions in the chat at this point, Brandy, that I should cover?
No questions in the chat yet, but I do have a question. You mentioned that the community foundations in Texas or in Houston is the Greater Houston Community Foundation, is that right?
Correct.
And then the one in Dallas, do they serve Houston as well, or?
Yeah, it's the Texas Women's Foundation.
The Texas Women's Foundation. Okay.
And the other one that I think is statewide is the Communities Foundations of Texas. I don't think they just focus on Central Texas. I think they might be statewide, but I could have that wrong. But the Texas Women's Foundation rebranded when they became a statewide foundation. So we actually have two community foundations that serve, if you will, directly our region.
Thank you.
All right.
And Christina did verify that the Community Foundation of Texas is statewide.
Oh, perfect. There you have it. So if you are looking for resources, community foundations should be on your radar. You should know those three. You should be on their mailing list. You should be interacting with their community folks. They usually have someone that's overseeing a database that their donors use to search for funding. So I always tell folks, reach out and make sure you're in the database, and then make sure your profile uses the words that their donors are going to use to look you up. Those are important elements that aren't always clearly communicated. But the way that their databases work is that staff of the community foundation, but individual donors can look up anything they want. So if they see a news article on literacy, if you don't have literacy on your profile and they go in that database at midnight because they got emotional about this news report, your organization name isn't going to come up. So you want to make sure that you are having your profile really lift up the types of things donors care about. And they're supposed to be helping you with that and giving you guidance at the community foundations in those areas. All right.
And yes, we will share the resources. I'm putting some links in the chat now, but we'll also share the resources after the meeting.
Yes, and I think, no, I'm not going to say who I think it is at the community foundation because I can't think of her name right now. All right, so a couple things to note. Corporate foundations can be private or public. Many of them are private and some do both. So for example, and on the next point, that they can have their corporate giving program and have a foundation. So Chase has a corporate giving program and they have a foundation. Wells Fargo has a corporate giving program and a foundation. BBVA Compass has a corporate giving program and a foundation. I listed those three specifically because they fund in Houston. So those should be the type of folks that you think about. On the corporate giving side, I think it's a lot more about visibility of their brand. So they love like to be on your t-shirt or to come give you the big check or be a sponsor. So it's those types of relationships. But on the foundation side, they usually have a strategy. And I would say a lot of the corporation strategy aligned to their priorities. So it might be they're interested in STEM, STEAM, or one of the other acronyms being used, or they might be interested in workforce development. And so getting familiar with how they work both on their foundation side and their corporate giving side You may not be eligible for one, but another might be a good fit for your organization. The other thing I would say is that public charities are supported through donations, and they can also re-grant. So an example of a public charity would be American Red Cross. They raise money, and then during disaster, they re-grant that money. United Way, they raise money, and then they have a whole process, Second Century Vision and all these things, where you, based on what they raise, they then re-grant that money out into the community. And then we're seeing a trend around in other communities where folks have come together to set up racial justice funds, that folks fundraise that money, and now they're re-granting it to small grassroots groups. So there's some work in Seattle, there's some work in Minnesota, some work in the South, that, and particularly in the Southeast, that do some of this re-granting as well. The other thing I would say is grant making strategies are so very different because they're influenced by the board and to varying levels staff. So not every foundation has what we call professional staff. There are some foundations who they hire their dad's friend, or they hire their former nanny who now needs a job. I mean, I've heard it all. And there's some foundations that have professional staff who have subject matter expertise. So you'll see an education program officer, and they're looking for someone to do that role who has been a teacher or a principal. And so depending on the structure of the foundation, it's not always just the board, it can be board and staff. But in a family foundation, sometimes it's at Thanksgiving, we decide what we are excited about and what we're going to give next year. And they are able to do that because remember, the 5% payout, file your 990, no self-dealing. There are not a lot of rules in terms of our grant making strategy. So that's why it can get very confusing, and also why our industry is known to be very fickle, because we change based on the interest of our donors. So there's that. So let's talk about some of the funding vehicles that I mentioned. So donor advised funds, also known as DAFs, D-A-F-S. DAFs are basically where someone says, I'm gonna put 100,000, $1 million into this account. I'm gonna get a tax deduction for it, and I'm gonna let it sit there, or I have some things I'm interested in funding. There is no timeline that the IRS requires folks who set up DAFs to spend that money. So there's a lot of critique about DAFs, that DAFs are just sheltering resources that could be used for the benefit of the community. Every community foundation has DAFs of some sort. While the money sits there, those assets are growing. So that money is making money, and they can fund what they're interested in. So they don't have to fund in a specific area. It is based on what they care about. It could be what they care about today. It could be what they care about last week. There are also what are called pooled funds, and other terms that are comparable would be special interest funds or funder collaboratives. So this is when multiple donors come to put their money together around something they're interested in, and they're going to do that funding collaboratively. And there's usually some sort of governance structure around it. So the Greater Houston Community Foundation, for example, has a youth homelessness special interest fund. They have an education special interest fund. These donors came together and said, we're concerned about youth homelessness and we want to do something. Our youth homelessness, it's called a point in time count, that was funded by that fund. People put resources in, and based on the resources that they put in, they get a certain vote because that's their governance structure. The Simmons Foundation and Houston Endowment are a part of a funder collaborative that's called the Houston Immigration Legal Services Collaborative, also known as HILS. We put money in, Houston Endowment put money in. It has a steering committee that includes direct service providers, and we collaboratively review grant proposals and make recommendations and fund that work. That collaborative has grown exponentially. So they are now getting national money. So it's now not just our little bit of money, it's national money that's coming in. And so now there's more money to put out into the community. We don't have a lot of collaboratives here, but we do have some. And so as you're thinking about your calls to action, I want you to know about these models that are out here as you start thinking about what do you all want to see for Black-led groups and for Black folks here in Houston. The other things that you'll see, funding vehicles, and this specifically usually lives at a community foundation, is what's called a designated fund. This is a donor who was like, I love hype. I'm gonna give all my money to hype. So, but they're not gonna give it all to you today. What they're gonna do is put it at the community foundation, and they're gonna decide how they give it to you. They're gonna give you a little bit at a time. They're gonna set it up so you get a payment every year. They might set it up that you get money until the money runs out when they, after they're gone. So a designated fund is a little bit different, but it's usually for a specific purpose. And then giving circles. So we don't have a long history of giving circles, but we do have some giving circles. So we have a Black giving circle, which is just slipped the name just slipped my mind, but we do have a Black giving circle that's funded at the Greater Houston Community Foundation. There's a Latino giving circle and an Asian giving circle, and those two giving circles have been around longer than the Black giving circle, but they exist. I believe the Dallas Women's Foundation has 2 or 3 giving circles that are Black women organized. And so in a giving circle, the giving circle members can put their money in, or they can raise money from others. And then the money that's raised is then re-granted out into the community. Heritage Giving Circle out of the Texas Women's Foundation is an example. They raise X amount of dollars every year, and then they re-grant it out to groups out in Dallas every year. Questions about these funding vehicles? I'm gonna get into some more shortly.
Yeah, Michelle, did you want to ask your question, or you want me to read it for you? Michelle Bonton.
You can read it.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Gotcha. Okay, so Kelly, I love the idea of collaborative. What would be your recommendation to Black Impact Houston to approach funders about a collaborative?
I would say what you want. Say we want a collaborative for Black-led groups and what that looks like, or can we vision together about what that would look like? I would recommend that you think about who are the funders who are already a part of an equity conversation, even if they don't have it figured out, because honestly, in my industry, none of us has it all figured out, but maybe they're saying the language on their website, they're doing something, but be real specific about what you're looking for. And what that could be. You can build that together. The Immigration Collaborative came out of a conversation United Way used to host that was called a grantor-grantee dialogue. They used to hold them, I think, once a year. And they would invite funders and direct service organizations to a conversation around a topic. It would usually be, I don't know, 50, 100 people there. And we'd come together around a topic. And they'd share some data about the topic, and then you'd hear some work on the ground that was happening. And what happened from that conversation is funders were like, we need to do something about what's happening in immigration. That's how that happened. It happened because the service providers were saying, this is what's happening on the ground. These are the resources that we need. And what they needed was a legal services system. What they were saying was folks were hopping around to different organizations and they weren't making it through the immigration process because they didn't have the right information. The legal services providers weren't connected with the social service providers, and they needed everybody to come together so they could streamline their systems, be clear in their message. So that's how that started. That started not because a funder said, this is what we want to do, but it was in partnership with direct service providers. So you all could be primed to think about what is a gap in the system, or what is a need in community amongst Black-led groups, and invite some funders to a conversation about how we can work together on that. I think that's doable.
Kelly, that was, Michelle kind of had part of my question too. So you mentioned the Simmons Foundation and Houston Endowment had this funder collaborative. Mm-hmm. who initiates that? So is that, so I know that there was a grantee and grantor dialogue that came, and from that dialogue, there you said that you wanted to provide funding, but how do you, were there any service providers that were saying like, hey, we want the Simmons Foundation, Houston Endowment to come together and add more? Or y'all just decided that collectively you would do that?
In hearing the problem and hearing that they already knew what they needed, funders were like, oh, but let's be clear. It was a lot of funders there. The only two funders that funded it were Houston Endowment and the Simmons Foundation, right? So just like we have the same issue about nobody wanting to touch Black work, the immigrant community has the same issue, right? They have the same issue. No one wants to be called an immigration funder in Houston. We struggle with this all the time. We tell funders all the time, if you fund in Houston, you're funding immigrants. We're one of the most diverse cities in the country, but they don't want to be labeled an immigration funder, right? And so you all are in a unique position in that a lot of people have put out equity statements. So what would it look like for you to invite funders who said they care about equity into a conversation about something you all have been talking about, to see where is their synergy, where is their interest, where are their opportunities?
Yeah, Michelle, you had something else to add, or did you want me to take the question that's in the chat?
So kind of both things, but Kelly actually answered, I think, Brandy, if you just take a peek at it and, let me know if you concur. She actually answered the chat question, because I was trying to say, okay, we've talked about convening these funders as part of our conversations with Black Impact Houston. And like, how do we reach them, and how, like what would be the approach, I think is what I was asking. But you said it, like, just make the invite, look at those who have, the equity statements and things like that. And Brandy, that was, kind of what we were talking about on our last call, not the last call, but the one before that, is kind of digging in and doing the research and then inviting them and just talking about the work that we are doing, so that they become aware that this is a great way for you to fulfill your mission or your action plan around equity.
Yeah.
So enough said.
I agree.
Any more questions before I go to the next slide? I'm happy to keep the convo going. No?
So this is helpful. Jolia just mentioned that the Giving Circle that's in Houston is the New Giving Collective.
Yes. And councilperson Tiffany Thomas is one of the founding members of that Giving Circle. Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna keep it moving. All right, so other funding vehicles I want to throw out. So I know I hear often from my smaller orgs, I've been trying to apply for grants and I'm never getting any grants and I don't understand the process. And I all of that is true. And I just outlined why that's true. It's not just you, right? It's not that your idea is not good. It's not any of those things. As you saw, our industry is set up such that the foundation controls the criteria. And so sometimes it's just that what they're looking for is actually not what anybody's doing. And unless you're willing to bend what you're doing, it's just not a good fit. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because you want to do what you're doing. You don't want to do what they're saying just because they have resources. So I always want to hold that up. And I know that's a tension because you got bills to pay. And so I don't in any way mean to minimize that, but I also want you to know there are other funding vehicles outside of grants that could also be a part of this conversation. And so impact investing. This is where folks are making money while doing good. And we have a lot of folks who are interested in that in Houston. They don't necessarily get a tax write-off, but there may be other returns that they could get. Housing is a good example. There are impact investors who want to help invest in housing because they're gonna make some money on the back end of it. And so thinking about business models and fundraising models that aren't just grants is an important, again, piece of this. CDFIs, I never remember what it stands for, so you're gonna have to Google it. But this is around loans and venture capital for communities. And a lot of that ends up being around small businesses, around real estate, around micro enterprises, also nonprofits. Micro lending is popular in that space. And so thinking about the types of work that your organizations does, this might be a space where some of the credit unions will be interested in talking to you. Some of these banks that have been doing their little statements might be interested because they're very much in the CDFI space. So thinking about how we as Black people address problems in our community, not just being from a place of charity, but also from a place of wealth building and power building, is something we talk a lot about at our foundation, and I think is a place where we can possibly get some synergy as a community. Social ventures, very similar. This is where there's a firm that's usually backed by investors. Social Venture Partners is a national group that uses this model. And it's a social entrepreneurship approach where they're seeking to solve a big problem. And they think there's an innovative way to do it, and they got the money to back it. And so we don't have a lot of social ventures here because no one has really carried the work. But nationally, there are folks who are interested in doing that type of work. Crowdfunding, GoFundMe is not just for people trying to pay for funerals and medical bills, right? It's also, crowdfunding is another way. One of the things that I talk a lot about when I'm presenting is mainstream philanthropy is not necessarily how Black folks give, right? We've always helped pay for tuition. We've always helped pay for books. We've done those things. And that is a model of philanthropy. And so crowdfunding, we should not think that that is not a way to raise money, right? Brandy's 20 for 20. You don't have to ask everybody to give you $100,000. Sometimes we need to look inward to say, what are we doing with Black donors, right? Because these big organizations, they're on all these webinars about how to reach donors of color, how to get diverse donors. Y'all are the diverse people who know the diverse people, right? And are you looking to our community? And are we cultivating those relationships, or are we only going to more formalized philanthropy? I tell people all the time, there was an organization I was giving $50 a month to. I had forgot. I thought I had canceled it. Well, I could thankfully afford the $50, right? I did not miss it because it was already coming out of my account. My $50 and 10 other people's $50 for a small organization is not little money because it's unrestricted. You don't have to give me a project. You don't have to send me a report. So thinking about how do we build our wealth within our organizations, because nonprofits are not supposed to be poor, right? Now, you're not supposed to be getting rich off your organization. However, you should be able to make a living wage, pay yourself and your staff, and get benefits. And that only happens when we have the resources. And so one of the limitations of my industry is, particularly with a lot of family foundations, they want to support projects. They don't want to support general operating. And general operating is what pays the bill. So some of these other vehicles provide the support that you need to do some of that. And then I'll end with leader circles. So your organization could have a leader circle, which is similar to a giving circle, where you ask folks who can give at a higher level, maybe it's $1,000 a year, and they get conversations with your CEO. They get time to learn about the issue. That model is popular amongst some of the larger organizations. United Way has a leader circle because they know all the donors that they get aren't the $50,000 donors. They have folks that are in the $1,000 range, and they cultivate those donors like they're big donors, because those folks are usually young-ish in their career. They have the potential to make more money. They will have life insurance and investments and other things that they could be giving to those organizations. So don't count out your small dollar opportunities, because my little money is better than the amount of time you're going to spend on a $5,000 grant. Hands down, it is definitely a greater return. So thinking about how do you bolster and think about your call to action, to also be a call to action to our business community on some of the impact investing, our business leaders who could become monthly donors to some Black-led groups. Be thinking very creatively about who you are inviting to this call to action, whatever you all decide it's going to be. In terms of how to get the money, I just put this in here because people always ask me. Always, always, always be mindful that, again, every foundation is going to have a different criteria. And so I always encourage people, dig into their website, figure out the terms that they're using, and you, for most foundations, are going to have to translate your work into their language. So I was just on a call with someone who actually was telling me that they had invited one of our partners to come into a federal grant with them on violence prevention. Now, our partner does not in any way think of their work as violence prevention. But if you look at the federal list of who gets funds for violence prevention, it's all kind of stuff. Abstinence only work is considered violence prevention. After school color crayons is considered violence prevention. Anything that's engaging children after school is considered violence prevention. And so this organization is doing dope work in the community, but they weren't thinking about their work in that lens. And so this person can get federal grants, has capacity, but they needed a community partner. That's not their strength. So they went to them and was like, look, we want to bring you in on this violence prevention grant. And they're like, but that's not what we do. She's like, it is what you do. You employ young people, and young people are out in the community doing training. What do you think they would be doing if they didn't have steady employment? So now they've been written into a $5 million 5-year grant, right? We don't know if they got it yet, but the language piece is an area I see really holds us up. At our foundation, we decided that it was our job to translate y'all's work so our board could understand it, but most foundations don't function like that. So it is your job, unfortunately, to figure out how your language can be moved into their language, because they don't understand what you do, right? These are folks who don't have lived experience with the problems that you're trying to solve, who are trying to do good in our community. And so the way that we help them until folks on my end can move the sector forward is to learn how to speak that language. And we can support each other in that. Y'all can have writing circles. Y'all can help each other review RFPs and grant applications. Do not fall into the trap that you do this work alone and that you're in competition with each other. It's enough money in Houston for all of us to get something. And as we support each other and build capacity with the air quotes, because I'm not going to get on that soapbox today, we can do that internally, right? We can bring in folks to help us skill build so that we can learn how to do that. If they say social determinants of health, try to figure out what in the world they mean by that and see, does my work actually fit what they're trying to say? And you got to speak that language. The application processes, the deadlines, they're all over the place. I always say, put it on your Google Calendar, and I don't want you to miss a deadline because there's no uniformity in how we do our work on our side of the table. So really be very organized and be targeted, right? If the circle don't fit in the square, I would get those things mixed up. If the circle don't fit in the square, don't use your time and then end up feeling defeated at the end because you spent so much time trying to make it work, right? So I said translate the language. I didn't say make up that you do a thing that you don't do, right? Because at the end of the day, those folks are thinking in this one narrow way. And sometimes it's better for your energy and your spirit to say, this is not the grant for me. And that's okay, because there are other resources. Houston doesn't only have resources that'll fund in Houston. There are national resources. There are other places that we can get what we need to get this engine started. I always say build relationships with individuals and ask the question. I know sometimes foundations are not transparent about who to contact, how to ask the question. If you're one of my grant partners, reach out and ask me. I tell folks all the time, if you're thinking about applying to a funder, I'd rather you call me or email me first so we can strategize than you submit something and then you submitted it and it wasn't in that language, and then it's a non-starter because you might have to wait a whole nother year, right? If you're not one of our grant partners, think about who's at this collective that could be a thought partner with you as you're thinking through your strategy. And then I will say, I am a firm believer in calls to action, accountability, and reparations in my industry, right? And there are some funders who are thinking about their resources as reparations. Not all of them, but some of them. But accountability to our industry that's saying we do equity work is a valid space to be, right? If we're saying we want to be equity funders, call us into relationship, right? Everyone's all afraid of being called out. Call us into relationship. You're saying equity funder X, we want to call you into a conversation because here's what we hear when we see that, and here's what we need it to look like, right? Call them into a conversation. Calls to action can be really, really powerful, particularly when we can hold the space as, dear funder, we see you put your letter out. We see you're trying to learn. Here's an opportunity. Here's an opportunity to support something that's already in the works. We're going to help you find us because you say you don't know where the Black-led groups are. You can come to the Black Impact group and we will help you figure it out, right? Like, call folks into that opportunity. Think about creative ways that you want to engage. And I'll say, some people are going to be resistant because they think if they show up, that you're going to ask them for a grant, right? Number two is always the most important, building the relationship, right? Building the relationship should always come before the ask, right? And so being able to bring people into this community in ways that make sense for y'all and that keep y'all safe and keep this space sacred is, I think, a good conversation for y'all to be thinking about. This is my favorite slide. Before I dig into the slide, are there questions, Brandy, in the chat?
Yes, I had a few, but so Julia answered the first. Oh, so one is, can you provide more info about the structure? Angelica, Dr. Avery asked this. Can you provide more info about the structure of writing circles?
Oh yeah, there's a lady. I sent it to Brandy, I think. Writing circles. So say there are 2 or 3 of y'all who are in relationship who are going to work on an RFP together. You may say, we're going to have a 2-hour Zoom, it's a writing Zoom. And you may spend some time writing. You may also spend some time strategizing, right? Because y'all's work, even though everyone says y'all do the same thing, there are nuances to your work that are not the same, right? And so Brandy, Jolia, and Angelica may just say, you know what, we want to strategize about how to approach this funder, right? I want to role play with you the conversation because I have a site visit coming up. Using that time as a time to do that work together, I think could be really powerful. I think having some norms, right? Like, it has to be a safe space, right? Like, I can't then see that you took my whole idea and took it to your CEO. Like, we need to be in integrity around it. But I do think that those supportive spaces are really important. You may feel like we can do it cross-sector, right? So you're applying for a STEM grant, I'm applying for a different grant. Again, coming together to strategize and plan. But there's a lady out of Atlanta, a Black woman, who runs like writing times. And she does work with folks who are applying for grants and fundraising. If I find that link when I finish the slide deck, I will put it in, or I'll send it to Brandy for her to send out to y'all.
And the other question that I had, and Dr. Avery, sorry I didn't ask you to unmute and read it yourself, but the other question that I just posted was, can you share more about the difference between mission creep and adapting our work into their language? Because I think we spend so much time early on, like, you know, don't change your work to accommodate it's mission creep. So wanted to know what you think the difference is.
So I think the difference is using their words is not changing your work, right? If you do literacy, you do literacy. Now, if they're because some of the things that are in our grant requests are not subject matter specific, right? We may say we want to fund equity in education. So if you are a literacy provider, you need to talk about how your framework accomplishes equity in education. you still literacy, but don't get so focused on here's my curriculum necessarily, but you want to talk about what is the change that's happening, right? What is the equity in your work? Your equity in your work could be you do parent partnerships where you support parents on supporting their child's literacy, and that the outcome is here is the grade level differential, and that is achieving equity in education. Because our kids in our program are now 9 months behind when they used to be 3 years behind, right? So even though you don't say equity in education on your website, the work that you do accomplishes that goal. Is that
Perfect.
helpful?
It is great. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Let me make sure. Yes, Jarvis, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, my question is about building relationships with foundations. I find that many foundations aren't as inviting as the Simmons Foundation. You'll send them an email, and that's the only way they want to correspond is via email. So we've been finding it really difficult to build relationships. I mean, do we meet them at art museums? Like, where do you meet these people to start building a relationship?
Good question. So I'll say a couple things. Well, the first is that I try to invite my partners into community. So we are one of the few where when I advocated for my title, I advocated for community engagement because I never want us to lose that as a foundation. And so one of the easiest ways, but time-consuming ways to get access to funders is figuring out what initiatives are they involved in. Meaning, where do they go to meetings? What community events are they involved in, right? So at one point, there was that Out to Learn group. I told everybody I knew in our portfolio, if you do out of school time, you have to go to that meeting. You have to. You might have to drop something else, but every funder who cares about out of school time is at that meeting. So the only way you're gonna get a funder to know who you are, to trust your leadership, is to be in that space, right? If you are involved in, I don't know, juvenile justice, right now, ASADA is convening a group around juvenile justice. They meet Thursday in the evening. I get on their calls at 6:30 at night. That's who I'm seeing. Who are the Black-led groups doing juvenile justice work, right? So that is the tricky part. So depending on the work that you're doing, trying to call that information from your peers about where do funders who care about STEM, where do they go, right? For a long time, the corporate folks, all they cared about was opportunity youth. Y'all never use opportunity youth on your website. What did that mean? Teenagers who are not in school, not working, and not in jail. Many of y'all were working with those folks, but you weren't at that meeting because you didn't even know what that meant, right? So as you all are hearing about initiatives, one thing that I think this group could be doing is sharing those meetings with your participants, right? Because some of the smaller groups don't know these convenings are happening, and so they need to be able to be a part of that work. I think those are ways to kind of break out and where funders start to see new leadership, see new innovation that's happening in the field. It's very hard to get them to come to your meeting to start because they don't have a relationship with you. So it is likely that will be the initial way to get kind of in the door. Same thing if you do civic engagement, you got to be a part of Houston in Action. You have to. That's the place. If you do anything around census, voter education, they even do some healthcare, whatever that is, civic engagement of folks in community and getting them involved in their neighborhood, you have to be involved in Houston in Action, right? And you can have thoughts about the efficacy of these collaborative tables all day, but at the end of the day, that is how this game is working right now, right? And so then you have to be strategic about your time. You can't be at all things. So if you're the leader and the visionary, you want to make sure those are the meetings you're at, and maybe send your support staff to the meetings that y'all really care about, where you're with other people who care about the things that you care about. So yeah, that would be my long answer. I think the other thing I would just add is family foundations are a puzzle that is very hard to figure out because they're family driven. Many of them have no community presence. And so that's why I say, sometimes we start our organization thinking, oh, we're just going to apply for a grant, because Houston has a lot of foundations. But family foundations is very, very difficult to get access to them. And so unless you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, it takes a very long time to get in with family foundations.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll also mention, Jarvis, that the Simmons Foundation hosts a monthly coffee. Well, I call it coffee and chat, but coffee chat. And it's virtual, and I tend to go every month. So part of it is I go not just to hear from the Simmons Foundation, but there are other organizations that show up and they share and chat, and I learn a little bit about their funders sometimes, and even be able to, there have been other foundations that have shown up for the coffee chat, that has been really helpful too, and was able to connect. I invited Jolia when she was in a different role to one of the coffee chats to come with me, and from there she was able to connect with one of the other foundations here in Houston. So I just think definitely I agree with you, Kelly, in finding where the development folks are within the foundations to be able to meet with them.
Yeah, I would say that I invite my peers to everything that we do, because I know that our way of doing our work is a little bit unique, right? And so I'm like, everybody is not gonna ask you for a grant, right? They just want to know who you are, right? They want to know what y'all are interested in, right? They want to know, like, is this even something you would fund, right? Y'all don't want to waste time chasing a foundation who's never going to fund you. So getting the answer is really what you want. And so I try to just encourage my partners and my peers to come to some of our things, because it's never, when we're on a coffee chat, y'all not really asking for money, right? You're building the relationship. We're talking about podcasts and, does your kid have to wear a mask to go to school? Like, we're building relationships, right? And that is a lot of what philanthropy is. It is relationship, right? It feels very transactional, but at the root of it is a level of trust that is being built over time. And so that is the benefit of being in some of these other spaces, that they're like, oh, Jarvis has been in a couple meetings. He sounds like he's really doing some good work. I'm gonna check out his website or his Facebook or whatever the case may be. And I will add that. Now, if you have a website, I'm gonna need your website to be up to date. If you don't use a website and you use Facebook, then use Facebook. Because often when they do hear about a group, they're looking you up online. They're not gonna just call Jarvis. They gonna come check out your stuff. And so everything you have out in the public realm are the things that people use to kind of get a sense of what you work on and what you do. And so I know we don't all have capacity to do the thing. So do something simple, right? Do something that's sustainable. Don't wait for the $50,000 website and then you can't update it, right? Start basic, but that has clear information, right? We're one of the few funders. I'll take a one-pager or a brochure, because we fund small grassroots groups. Most funders won't do that, right? I get one of my grant partners, all they had was their Facebook. So that's how I did my whole write-up, on their Facebook, pulling out information, so that I could share to my board why they were a good fit for our portfolio. So we do all do our work differently, but your outward facing information needs to be clear so that they can get a sense of who y'all are. Anything else, Brandy, before I go to these last few slides?
Yes, Jacqueline,
Okay.
Hold on. No, you're getting compliments, a lot of compliments. So great information. Thank you, Jacqueline, for joining. And yes, we will send the recording to everyone. So we're ready for the next one.
All right.
Kelly, I had one quick question. This is Angelica. Can you tell us, you were saying that a juvenile justice group that meets, and I think you said at like 6:30 in the evening. What was the name of that group you mentioned?
Hold on, I'm gonna look it up on my phone. It's led by Asada Richards, and it is called Redefining Youth Justice Coalition. This coalition started about maybe 6 months or so before COVID, and it was supposed to be something completely different. The power of this coalition is that, one, juvenile probation is very active in the county judge's office, but they're actually going to be getting resources from Harris County that they will be re-granting out into the community, right? That's happened in a year, right? We've never had investment at the county level. So it is significant that that work is happening. I think the opportunity is closed, but they just had an RFP open for a backbone to receive the money and oversee giving the money out. So I'm not sure if they've made that final determination, but right now it's usually it's been a lot on building norms and communities. And then they have 1 or 2 subgroups that are meeting. And so hopefully, part of the reason that that structure is there is that many of the small groups don't have the infrastructure to go through the county procurement process, right? So one of the things was the small groups who have the credibility in the neighborhood can't actually get the money that the county has. How do we figure this out? And so this is another example of how that collaboration is able to hopefully move resources to some of the smaller groups working in neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you for sharing that additional information. I think there's a space for a lot of the groups and the work that Black impact organizations are doing that could really have some, can lend some support to work around that topic. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And Michelle has her hand up. Michelle?
Yes, thank you, Brandy. I just wanted to piggyback on what Kelly is saying about the juvenile justice group. I am a member of one of the subcommittees that is, kind of working to establish criteria and things like that for the selection kind of process. And I just wanted to say that without going into a whole lot of detail, keep watching for that RFP, because there was a lot of discussion that we just had last week with Asada and other members about wanting to make sure that there was a broad base. We want to make sure that enough people know about it to apply, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
So keep watching is what I'm saying for that RFP. If you see something that says that it's closed today, I'm saying continue to go back. Okay.
And should that change, Michelle, if you send it to Brandy can send it out to the listserv. Because I send Brandy opportunities that I think y'all should know about, because we don't have a good distribution process at my foundation. But I think these are the types of ways that y'all can support each other, right? And being at some of these tables. So this is awesome.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you for that suggestion.
So Jarvis, if you do anything with young people or supporting parents, that coalition would be a great place to start to come to. Because remember, private foundations aren't the only ones with money. The county has money, the city has money, all these people have money, right? So when you think about philanthropy, we want y'all want all the funders, right? All different types of funders to be a part of what's happening with Black folks. So
Good.
Awesome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So my next slide is one of my favorite slides, because there is a national movement to move philanthropy. And so there's a lot of think pieces that are happening. Some folks are not happy. Some people are lumping some of the changes happening in philanthropy with this fake critique of critical race theory that my children graduated from Texas high school, so I would tell you they barely learned who Martin Luther King was. So why we act like we learning something that and make it a law about something that doesn't exist, we can save for another day. But there are a lot of think pieces that are happening. But what I love about this moment is watching leaders of color writing in response. And so the piece that says this moment in history, the call for philanthropy's transformation, written by 2 women of color, was making the rounds on LinkedIn and online, and others who are writing about the changes that are happening. The way that Mackenzie Scott is disrupting the field right now, lots of critique, lots of thought pieces about that. I think that particularly those of y'all who do community-based organizing and power sharing and shifting work, not necessarily like direct social services work, there's a lot of opportunity nationally to get resources. We only had one Houston group, I think, on Mackenzie Scott's last list, which I want to say was Project Row Houses. But I will say that this way of giving money, where this donor is engaging with thought leaders in philanthropy about who's doing the work that she's interested in, and then her team is doing research and giving gifts out. And these are not little gifts, right? Children's Defense Fund, what do we get? 20 million, Brandy? We've never, right? Mary Wright Edelman has led this organization for 40 years, and this is our largest gift, right? And so this lady is disrupting. Now, mind you, she made all her money back in like 3 days. So that's another conversation for another day. But I think that for those of y'all who are doing power building and power sharing work based in neighborhoods and with communities, this is a unique time for y'all to be thinking about opportunities outside of local philanthropy, because you're not necessarily seeing that here. And so for a lot of our grant partners who do this work, national funders are their best vehicle right now. And so I think knowing where you sit in things, if you do direct services, there's a lot of opportunity and resource here. But if you do this other type of work, not so much. And so there's an interesting shift. There are foundations that are asking different questions. You may think you may chuckle when you see it, but more and more foundations in Houston are asking about equity. They're talking about equity. And so it's important for you all to be clear, because just because you're Black led don't mean you're leading from equity, right? Just because you're Black led doesn't mean you're about the social justice and liberation of Black people, right? Some of our work gets steeped into how do we make you more middle class, or how do we make you more presentable? Like, we get caught up in the rigmarole as well. And so I think it's important for us to be clear that being Black led doesn't always translate into the type of Black led groups they want to fund, right? And so reading through their materials and understanding their language, I think, is an important part of that. I think in more niched areas like education equity or STEM or STEAM, equity looks a little different, right? It's more like getting more representation, right? So more better grades, or more graduation, or more going to college, or more women in STEM. So that's going to look very different than those who are doing some of the community organizing funding as well. So wanted to make that distinction for y'all. Any questions about this part? Because I know it's not Houston centric.
Christina, did you want to jump in on your comment? It's great.
Yes, thank you. So I just put a comment in the chat that says, you know, some of us who are the Black leaders are leading organizations that have boards that primarily do not look like us. So then there's a struggle on a different level when it comes to truly embracing equity. And so we have been placed in the position of being the face of equity, so to speak. so that the board can say, yes, we're all about equity. We have a Black person leading this organization, but that's where they want the equity to start and stop. They don't really want equity in its true form. So then that struggle exists there. And, you know, as we know, we can't transform boards overnight. That's a process. But in the meantime, I think that's another really nuanced aspect of this. So when funders are looking at, for example, I've seen recently funders asking the question about board composition. I always feel like there needs to be that opportunity for the backstory there, because, you know, let's face it, if you're hired and you inherited a board that's primarily white, you inherited a board that's primarily white. Doesn't mean that the work is not being done to change that, but that's a process.
Yeah. Well, I will say we ask that question, and we also say, and our board is all white. And we are going through a process, right? So hopefully, as funders are asking this, they're asking it from a place of learning, not from a place of like, oh, I got you. Like you don't actually have it all figured out, right? Like I think there is that. And I also think that I'm seeing a lot of folks resign because they're like, I'm not going to stay if you really don't want to do this work, right? And I think that organizations who are committed, they may not go fast, but they're going somewhere, right? So one of the conversations I was in today, what we said was having baseline data is better than saying, I don't know. So if the first step that you can take is to get the data, that's a conversation starter. And that's how we use our questions around demographics in an organization, because we know, like I said, we no longer ask about data on clients and people served. I feel like people in Houston have, particularly Black and Brown people, have been focus grouped and surveyed and landscape scanned to death, and we still don't fund the work. So what we want to know at our foundation is senior leadership, middle management, frontline staff, volunteers, and board. We want to know those demographics and use that as a conversation, because for some folks, having that data because the Simmons Foundation asked for it is the tool that the leader uses with the board to say, I'm not making this up. Philanthropy is now asking these questions. What is our plan, right? And so thinking about how can you use these points as leverage, even if you don't get the grant, you now have a baseline, right? And now you can start making the case with your board differently, that philanthropy cares about it. Even if we don't have it all figured out, we ask them the question, right? And so those are strategies that I think are important in this moment, particularly when you are the sole leader and you're trying to be in an institution that you're trying to shift, because that's not easy. So y'all need to provide Christina with some support, right? Ask her what she needs, ask how you can help her strategize, be a thought partner with her as she's in her organization, because you don't want her to burn out, right? Because particularly if it's a mainstream org that has been visible and seen, I don't know what org you're with, but we want her to be successful. And successful is not that she does a good job, because we know she's going to do that. Successful is that she can stay in that environment while they're going through their change process, or she can help move the change in that organization. So y'all better be Team Christina up on this call.
Christina, that's great. I hadn't seen it from that lens. So I put all those questions Kelly just asked, I asked in the chat for you. So how can we help? How can we be your thought partner? You know, we had some of the same dialogue. My board is predominantly Black, and then the Black Lives Matter movement took place. And we just happened to vote our first white board chair. And I was like, uh-oh. And people started, and no one had asked our board makeup before then. And I was like, wait, now that we have a white board chair, what does that look like? So yes, I hadn't thought about it from the other lens. So thank you for sharing.
Anything else before I switch our slides? I don't know what else is on here. Let's see. Oh, go ahead. Okay. The other thing I wanted to share is that there are some calls to action that are happening, and I'm gonna go through a detailed list. But as you're thinking about this particular group and what you want to invite philanthropy into, folks are doing open letters. ABFI, which is basically the Black Folks in Philanthropy, that's our association, had put out a call. There's about 60 Black CEOs across the country who are in a similar position as Christina, right? They're leading a foundation, but they have an all-white board, or they're leading a foundation that says they care about equity, but they're still not funding sufficient number of organizations led by impacted folks. And so I want to share with you that there are multiple calls to action that are happening, and I just wanted to give you all some ideas. The things in parentheses are organizations, either their acronyms or their names. I could not get you all the links, so you're gonna have to do a little Google. But there are some calls to action for philanthropy to increase the 5%. There's one call to action that says they should spend all their money. There's another that says during times of disaster, such as COVID or other disaster, they should increase their payout to 10%. I will say that many foundations do pay over their 5%, but not all. It's not required. And so it's very subjective. And I think, I don't know what the payout is for Houston foundations. I don't know who's tracking that data. I don't, and why the payout is important is when folks say, well, our budget is only X amount, that doesn't mean they don't have more money in the bank, right? The 5% is what they're saying they're going to give out, but they might have $1 billion in the bank, right? And so some of the critiques of the 5% are that there are more resources that could be going to our communities than are actually going now. So wanted to give you some context. One of my favorite blogs, Nonprofit AF, Vu has written about that. FSG has a more scholarly approach, but they have a report on it. There's another call about diversifying family foundation boards. So families are not required to open their board to outsiders. But there is a move for family foundations to have non-family members, particularly those who have some subject matter expertise or lived experience, to help them as they're thinking about their strategy and recommendations that they're making. So Stanford Social Innovation Review and Bridgespan have both put out some reports on why diversifying family foundation boards is important. Because think about it, if you sat with all your cousins and aunties, and those were the only voices that you listened to in your grant making decision, what would that look like, right? And that is often the dynamic of a family foundation. Just like you don't always get along with your auntie, they don't always get along with their aunties, right? It's the same dynamic. But because the rules don't require the boards to be open, this is a call to action that's happening. Another call to action is around participatory grant making. And so that framework is saying, let the impacted people be decision makers. And there's a group that's now defunct called the Funding Exchange that has some good resources. Their website is still active. I have a colleague on the East Coast that's an education funder, Black woman. Her organization after George was murdered was that they wanted to do something. And so they just set up a participatory grant making process. They paid community members over a year to help them design the process, the application, the criteria, the scoring, and they are now opening their RFP, and I think they have 20 million that they're going to give out in their community. So that is not going to be decided by the board. That's going to be decided by community members who sit on that committee on how that money goes out into the community. So participatory grant making is a model and a call to action that's happening. Another is around, I said lowering barriers to entry. I don't like that term, but I couldn't think of a better one in the midnight hour. But it's around streamlining the application process and having equitable screening criteria, right? So that we don't privilege the written word, right? We say we want to fund impacted folks, but if impacted folks didn't graduate from high school, but you're expecting a 20-page grant report, that's not equitable, right? Even though they may be doing the work and doing the work very well, right? And so, for example, like I said, in our organization now, we will take any grant we'll take any grant you've ever written, or we'll take a one-pager or your brochure or your website, because some of our partners have never written a grant before, right? We're not saying that that skill isn't important to engage with other funders, but what we're saying is we want to see your work. We don't want to get bogged down and lost in your ability to perform in this perfectionism kind of white dominant culture way of communicating, right? Because the work is what we care about, right? So one of our groups working with Black trans women in Houston, baby, I don't want you to write me a 20-page report when the governor is trying to kill the community. Tell me what you do, and our staff will write that into the format that our board needs to see it. So we've decided that that is the role of our program officers, to translate what they do into the language, right? So that's what I mean by that. So I can take what they do off their Facebook and say it in the way that my board will understand it, right? Because if I gave that language to my board, they'd be like, Kelly, what is this? We don't understand what this is, right? And so we decided that's our job at our foundation. So that is becoming more popular. So there is a foundation that has put all their resources into a model called trust-based philanthropy. They have a website. They've asked foundations to sign on. Trust-based philanthropy model includes streamlining your application process. It includes moving towards general operating multi-year support. It includes providing support beyond the check, like support for capacity building and other things. And so they're a good example. And I've been in philanthropy for 10 years. We've been saying this for 10 years. So I say this with a clear understanding that this is not going to be an easy battle, right? We're, I think, one of the only people in Houston that does our work in this way. And there's still other ways, right? I have partners in Florida who just gave out $5 million, and they did 30-minute videos. They answered the 5 questions in a little video and submitted it. That was the application. And that money is out the door, right? And so our process doesn't have to be burdensome. And so the call to action is, hey, philanthropy, you don't have to do your application this way. We're calling you into a conversation about how can you streamline this process to make it more equitable for folks doing the work. Another call to action is around tracking and increasing funding to organizations led by people of color, right? Black Philanthropy Houston has a call to action on their website. The ABFI, the Black group that I mentioned before, Groundswell Fund, they all have letters, they have calls to action saying, you can do this and we want you to do it. So the benefit of our demographic data that we ask on our application is, I can tell you that in 2020, the Simmons Foundation, 60% of our grants were led by people of color. The organizations were led by people of color. If I didn't ask the question, I wouldn't know the information, right? And so asking that question gives us a benchmark, and then I can see the nuance. We're actually not doing a great job with Asian-led and Native-led organizations. So now in my outreach strategy, which is my job, I'm trying to find the folks who are Asian-led and Native-led in Houston doing the types of work we say we want to fund, right? In our repro portfolio, we're doing a great job in Latina-led orgs. We're not doing a great job in Black-led orgs, right? So I can look across issue area and see where we're doing well and where we're not, because we said, we didn't put out a statement, but we said we care about social justice. And so that means we have to be funding groups led by people of color. So asking funders to track the data and to share the data is another call to action that's been happening. Another is diversifying investment and investment managers. So remember, I said philanthropy is not only about the grant, right? So who is managing the money? What firms are managing the money, right? Are Black-led investment firms in Houston a part of managing portfolios? Some foundations manage in-house, but some hire external managers. If you have an inside team, do you have people of color who are on your investment team? Do you have people of color who are accountants, who are on your legal team, right? Like when we talk about this work, it's not just more Black program officers. It has to be on every level of our organization. So those calls to actions have been happening, and the Knight Foundation has some information about what they've been tracking and how they want to see us diversify there. Annie EKC does some work around diversification of procurement. Who are we hiring as caterers? Who's providing our office supplies? Who are we using as consultants for strategic planning, for capacity building, right? Again, when we talk about wealth building in Black communities, it's not just about social services. It's also about some of these other vehicles, right? To make sure that equity is not just on the receiving of services, but also in our business model and how we do our work. And so Annie EKC has some information on their website about vendors, et cetera. There is a call to action to, I said, spend the money. It's called spend down or sunset. So for example, our foundation is not designed to be around forever. So our bylaws are clear that we will sunset at some point. That process hasn't started, but there are foundations who say, we don't want to hoard our money. We want to spend our money over a certain period of time and get it out. I have a friend in North Carolina, their foundation is giving themselves 10 years to spend all their money. And so they're very aggressive in how they give their money out, because the more money longer it sits in the bank, the more money it makes, right? And so they don't want to be around forever. So that means they got to give out larger and larger amounts of money to meet their goal of spending down. So Decolonizing Wealth, there's a book written by Edgar Villanueva, and a movement that Edgar has started around not hoarding wealth, that is a great resource and a book conversation worth having in Houston. Resource Generation, which is young wealthy folks who are talking about reparations and getting their money out the door. And then the Giving Pledge, which is like the old heads, like the Buffetts and the Gates, who said, we're gonna spend all this money in our lifetime. I don't know how that's possible given the amount of money they make every minute, but they've signed the pledge. So I would suspect some of that money will be given to other foundations because they have accumulated so much money. I don't know how they would possibly give it away that fast. And then the last thing I'll say is around accountability and transparency from the folks who made racial justice statements. So Candid, which is, they combined, GuideStar and somebody came under one umbrella and they named themselves Candid. You can take that for what it is. But they're starting to track the money based on the pledges that people made around racial justice, right? People weren't just making it rain, they made pledges. So they are starting to look at who made a pledge and what happened to that pledge and where did those resources go. So that work is new, but for those who did make a pledge, if they made a financial pledge, starting to track what that looked like. If they made a generic statement about their learning journey, tell us about your learning. What's happening? You know, it's been a year and a half. We want to be in conversation with you around where you all are in that work. And so those are some of the national calls to action that are being made to philanthropy in this moment. Brandy, questions?
No questions. I was just doing an amen corner to you. I'm talking about how they're gonna spend all of their money, but I don't have any
Brandy,
questions.
I did have a question. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
yeah. Okay, go ahead, Michelle.
Okay, I'm gonna make it super quick. So Kelly, you and let me just kind of put this disclaimer out there. I hope that this is an elephant in the room as I ask this question. So I'm going out on a limb, but I feel like the question needs to be asked. So you talked about, Kelly, you know, organizations of color, right? And you talked about, you know, how Simmons is looking at, you know, maybe trying to do more with Asian organizations and all that. We are Black Impact Houston, and we want to know, because there is a call from other groups of color, right, who are, you know, kind of doing some of this same work, I suspect, that we at Black Impact Houston are trying to do. How can we, I guess, make our voices heard as Black Impact Houston out of the crowd? Does that make sense? That's the best way I can put that in a short kind of statement. I'm sorry.
Well, I will say, I don't know if it is a crowd.
Okay.
there's an extreme power dynamic where people in Houston do not call on philanthropy, right? We whisper to each other about philanthropy, but there's not a public call to philanthropy in my experience in Houston. Now, I will get people who will call me and be like, Kelly, I don't understand, right? I get that. And that is not the same thing as a collective unified voice saying, philanthropy, this is what we want to see from you, right? So I don't think that field is crowded at all.
Okay.
I think that folks, and I have not heard of other communities of color organizing. That doesn't mean it's not happening. I just haven't heard of it. So I will say that. Our portfolios, and I can only speak for Simmons, in the other areas, we're doing pretty good with Black-led groups, right? We're not at 100% because 100% of our orgs aren't led by people of color. But when we looked across our issue areas, there were certain issue areas where we weren't doing well. I would say overall, we were pleasantly surprised. We didn't think we would get to 60% as fast as we did. When we did our there's a survey that Philanthropy does, the Center for Effective Philanthropy. We did that survey in 2019. I think we had 60 or 70% was white lit. And we were shocked because we were like, we say all the right things on our website. So how is it that saying the right things still didn't get us to the organization? So we had a lot of work to do. So I was pleasantly surprised when we looked at our 2020 data to see where we had gotten to once we did our strategic, realignment. But it does require us to be in conversation. So we had to ask people like, what are we missing here? What things do we need to be doing differently? What spaces do we need to show up in? How do we make sure folks know that they can apply? How do they know that our process is accessible? Those are things that we were thinking about as we were trying to do that. And I think that where my peers, because I would say for the majority of my peers, they are team y'all. They are team y'all. They get y'all's work. They know why the work is important. They have a board that doesn't always get it. And so some of the work is us helping them make whatever case they need to make to do their job, right? Because I've seen particularly program officers of color who are trying to get work through and they can't get it past their board, right? So we have the same problem internally that y'all have. So I want to be clear about that because I know sometimes y'all get frustrated because you're like, someone once, had reached out to me. She's like, I just think we need more Black program staff. I was like, that is not going to help this problem. We need more diverse boards at foundation level, in my opinion, because we're not the final decision maker. I'm not the final decision maker in my organization. I said yes to this presentation and then told my boss after. I was like, now if you fire me, I was trying to do the right thing, right? I'm not the final decision maker in my organization. And so even though y'all see us as people with power or whatever the case may be, we are still small fish in the pond in which we swim. So I think those are important nuances. And I think it also speaks to this call to action because program staff are also frustrated, right? They want to do more funding of Black-led groups in particular in this moment. And it is sometimes very challenging. So I just wanted to put that out there. So don't be yelling at my friends because you like, they finally got a Black person that I still can't get a grant. Don't yell at my people now.
We won't, Kelly. Jolia has a question.
Hey, Kelly.
Hi,
I'm on the
Jolia.
road, so there may be some background noise. I just want to thank you for this presentation. It's been so good. Like you mentioned early on that it was a lot of information that we might have known, but I've learned a lot of really new things this afternoon. So thank you. And thank you for putting your job on the line for us. I heard you talk about some of the collectives that are already established in the Houston area, including the one on immigration and youth homelessness. And I want to ask you about sort of the other end of the spectrum than what you've been talking, you know, from the philanthropy perspective, but flipping the coin a little bit and ask, in terms of those collectives, what are some of the best practices you're seeing that really helps them to function well as collectives in terms of funding, in terms of planning, and all of those things that might help us better inform Black Impact Houston as we're establishing and growing it?
Yeah, very good question, Julia. A couple things I will say is, one, being clear on the requirements for participation, right? If y'all are open group, are you a closed group? Is there a membership? And from that, governance. How do you make decisions, right? How do you reach, is consensus your model? Like, what is your model to make sure that everybody's clear on what we're working toward and how we get to a yes? I think are big pieces of that. And also not spending 2 years trying to figure that out, right? I think we get scared of commitment because it is very traumatizing to deal with philanthropy and the no's, and that feeling, that scarcity mindset that philanthropy feeds sometimes allows us to turn on each other. We don't trust each other. We're scared we're going to steal from each other, right? And I'm not saying that there won't be people who try to do that, but I am saying trying to hold a generative space and a healing space and an acknowledgement that this industry has created an environment that we don't want to perpetuate, right? So I think that's really important. I think at some point, if you all start thinking about bringing in resources, you're going to have some kind of MOU and clarity about participation so that folks are on the same page and that you are clear on who is the decision maker. So in my experience in coalitions, sometimes the waters get muddy when folks think my organization being a part of this means we co-sign everything, right? Because my organization only does X. What your organization does is what your organization does. What this collective does, y'all just need to be on the same page with the principles and the movement. Y'all don't have to do the same work, right? And so some people are like, oh, I can't say yes to that because we do advocacy or we don't do advocacy. You as an individual org are not what is out front. What's out front is the collective. So I think helping people distinguish and differentiate when it's something about their individual org and when it's something about the collective so that they can let that tension go, because it's actually not a real tension. We're not asking you to change your work. What we're saying is, can the collective sign on to this statement, or can the collective apply for this grant? That should not, so getting clear on that. I think the other one, and this is for, I had to do this work as a grant maker, is dealing with our money baggage. We have a lot of trauma around money, particularly as, like, for myself, I'm the first real middle class person in my family, right? Where there are not months where I'm eating ramen and oatmeal, right? And so I got money stuff I had to work out. I had issues saying one organization was going to get a $50,000 grant and another organization wasn't, and the guilt and all of the things. And so I don't say that lightly. I'm very serious. Do your money work, right? And being clear that money is actually not the end goal. People are the end goal. Money is one of our tools. It is not the tool. And for you all as a group to do some of that healing work around it, I think would be really, really important, particularly if you want to move the resources.
Thank you, Kelly. All of that money is one of the tools. It is not the tool. And I agree, there's so much. I individually, as a person, personally, I need to do my own work, just like you said, around money and trauma and things like that. I think for me, one of the biggest takeaway, one of the biggest actions in terms of building out Black Impact Houston is determining, you mentioned very early on in the call about having clarity around what you're asking funders, like what we're going to ask funders. If we're going to put out a statement of action, or if we're going to put out a call to action. We need to be clear on what it is, not just come in and saying we some Black folks and we want some money, but being very clear around what that is. So awesome. I'm gonna listen to this again and again. Thanks, Kelly.
You're welcome. And hi, Theater. That's my baby.
Yeah, you hear him in the back. Yeah.
I do. Black joy. I love it. And Black joy is our resistance, y'all. Hold that, right? Don't center philanthropy in this work, right?
Repeat it
Don't
one
do
more
it.
time. Repeat it one more time. You cut off that Black joy. Repeat that one more time, Kelly.
Oh, I was saying to center Black joy and Black healing and Black liberation, and not to center philanthropy in this work.
You know, I think it's hard. I mean, you're making some valid points, but I think it's wonderful to have the reminder, because as Black leaders, we work so hard, because without philanthropy, there's a lot of things that we can and cannot do. And so being able to have this reminder, I think has been awesome. So I thank you.
You're welcome. So Jalea queued up my next slide, which is my invitation to y'all. My invitation to y'all is to be bold, to be Black and be unapologetically Black, and to be yourselves, right? Don't feel like you have to bend to fit into the cultural norms. You don't have to raise money like other people. You don't have to resource your organizations like other folks. Do it in a way that is authentic to who we are as Black people. I say to folks often that it frustrates me to no end to see us as Black folks get a little bit of change, and then we want to give like white folks give. I want to give like Black folks give, right? I want to give from my humanity and with my whole self, right? And so I think that I've really tried to hold myself into accountability that, yeah, I might give my $50 a month to a couple organizations, or I might try to get to 1,000 for a particular organization for the year, because I'm still on the penny side. But I also try to lift up their work, right? I try to open doors in other ways. I try to help them think about board members. I try to really think about, like, how do I as a Black woman show up for my Black people? And that's how I want to show up for the nonprofits, right? And so really being true to who y'all are, I think, is important. And to what Jalea said, I want y'all to be clear in your ask. Again, it doesn't mean that you have to be at consensus at 100%. There may be some things that galvanize y'all, and those are the things you can agree upon, but be clear in who your audience is. Are you talking to community foundations, private foundations, corporate foundations? Are you trying to get to DAFs and free that money? Like, are you trying to get impact investors? Like, who are the people that you all are talking to? Because they all care about different things, and you'll have the slide deck to kind of go back to. And then what are your levers of accountability? Your statements are levers of accountability that folks have made. The language they're using on their website are levers of accountability. But also, don't be afraid to hold us in accountability, right? I said before, like, don't cancel the people, but call them into community, right? Teach them how to be in community, right? That's one thing we know how to do, right? When someone was talking earlier with me about an organization, she went to their event, and as a funder, when she showed up, it looked really disorganized and chaotic. As a Black person, she was like, oh, I know exactly what's going on. And their turnout was amazing, right? Because there's a way that we are together that she was not judging from her middle class perspective, right? She was like, oh, they feel safe here to show up as their whole selves, which is why they come, right? And so that showing people how to be an authentic community with Black folks, I think, is also a gift that you all can offer and is a lever of accountability, because y'all know they call you when they can't get the Black people there. So let's think about what does that look like, right? But what does that look like to say, okay, well, here's how you show up for us. So yeah, so I leave you with these two last slides where this group, if you are fundraising at your organization, it's a newish blog. They have a Slack channel. I hate Slack, but they have an active Slack channel. And they're sharing resources, but it's all for fundraisers of color. And it's in a community-centered perspective. And these are a couple of the articles that they just sent out. And so I think it's a list worthy. There's some podcasters now who are specifically talking to fundraisers of color. And if you don't have a development person, you are the fundraiser. So you can consider yourself a development professional. And so these are the part of the conversations that you should be a part of. They're going to help you skill build. They're going to share RFPs. They're going to share different grant opportunities. So thinking about the ecosystem outside of Houston is a part of it, but there's money all over this country that is available to Black folks in Houston, and we want to be able to tap into all of it. And that's it.
Awesome. So I have a couple of closing things to mention, but I want to just open it up to any reactions, comments, questions, any aha moments that anybody would like to share.
My name is Linda Gray, and I just want to take the time. I really did enjoy this session. It has really opened my eyes up as well. I'm out of the Dallas, Texas area, but I'm also a certified SCORE mentor. And I do mentor by virtual to a lot of nonprofit organization leaders. And I tell you what, I sent out a request because I do want to help support the efforts in our Black community, especially in our state of Texas. Our state is geared up where and we just have to say it, politics, and you know, that's what we're going to have to deal with, but it's on a legislative level. But one of the things that really, and I personally can say this as a Black woman, I have been sort of held back because the state of Texas legislative says that white women, and I don't have anything against white women at all. I really don't. I'm a woman and I really don't. But here in Texas, the white women are considered, when it comes to government contracting, they are considered the minority population. They really are. So they have equal or more access to federal contracts. So I just want to appreciate the presenter, Kelly King Jackson. Yeah, I appreciate your presentation, and I do look forward to supporting any of the efforts toward the group here. And so I wanted to say that. And then look, I thought I was a part of the group and I had my face, you know, like I'm fitting to get ready to present, and I had no idea, you know, that I was the only one on the camera. And so I started scrolling around to see if I could see, and everybody was with the camera except for you special presenters. So anyway, I wanted to say that. So anyway, thank you a lot.
Thanks for being here.
We love seeing your face. It just happened to be like that today, Miss Linda.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Jarvis, did you have your hand up?
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. Anybody else wanted to share before we close out? So Kelly, we'll save the chat, and you probably see it now that you're not presenting, but I mean, compliments. And I would say exactly what we need. Kelly knows that I am learning how to do better in telling the story. I was going to use some other words. And I love partnering with Kelly because she helps us to be bold and to be Black and be, unapologetically Black in a space that I feel like I've been a nonprofit leader now for over 22 years. And when I jumped into this space, I had no idea, like many of you, and didn't always show up to be who I really was, because the goal was to get the money. Like I have some children and some families to serve, and so have found a way to be able to be acceptable to others, to make sure that we got the resources that we need. But I think it's the time now for us to be able to kind of break some barriers and really step into a space where we could do more and we can be more. So I jumped into the call and really I didn't set the framework about what our time was going to be and what our intentions were going to be. Part of me being extremely nervous because y'all showed up. Like I was like, they came, Kelly. Kelly and I had this conversation probably in January or February where I was just like, oh my God, Houston Endowment just funded like all of these Black-led organizations. I was grateful we were one, but I was like, hey, but there's so many other organizations out there, and I don't even know the ones that's on this list. And so how do we bring all of these organizations together? And so if you got the invitation today, it was because we did some like snooping around on the internet and grabbed the list of Black-led organizations that Houston Endowment funded. We also used the list from the Greater Houston Community Foundation and just sent the invitation out to you. And so as Kelly talked about kind of our statement and our call to action, there's a smaller group of us that have been meeting just about what is it that we can do to make sure that now that, Black lives do matter and people are saying it, how do we make sure that we stay on the forefront of everyone's mind? Because, being Black, it's not going to be that popular very much longer. Like it's not, it is now, but our time is going to fade away, just like opportunity now youth. Like we used to talk about that all the time. Now we're not. So how do we make sure that we capitalize on this time and that we hold them accountable to say, no, we're not a trend, that this really is our life, and it is our life, and we've been called to be able to make impact in communities where we need some support to be able to do that. And it should not dictate whether or not we're Black led if we get the same resources that some of our white counterparts get. Ms. Dixon, I saw you come off mute. Was that intentionally done? Did you have something to add?
No, yes. Wait a minute. No, I do not have anything to say. I'm listening on this one.
Okay, gotcha. So I jotted down a couple of notes. We have your contact information. Be on the lookout from us to be able to share the recording with you, share the resources that are there. I'll tell you now, as Kelly said, y'all gonna have to do your own research. I was like, anybody that want to research some of those things. What I did not mention is, yes, I'm executive director of a nonprofit organization in Houston. It is Hype Freedom School. I typically don't talk a lot about what we do and how we do it because I do want it to be about the collective. But we really don't have staff to do Black Impact Houston. But it has been a call that I know is there, and there's a team of us that's on the call right now. As I mentioned, Jolia, Michelle is on the call, and there are a couple of other ones and Aurelia is here. There are a couple of us that have been meeting to be able to really kind of create the agenda around Black Impact Houston. So we invite you to join us. It's new, we're developing, we're starting, but I have put the call to action and a sense of urgency to our planning team to say, like Kelly said, we're not going to wait for 2 years to be able to launch this, that we do want to make it happen. So our next meeting is on August 19th at 9:30 a.m. We'll send out notification to you with that information to join us. It is all virtual. We're remaining virtual during our time together. And then I'll also mention that we're having some conversations about a statement on 8/28. So Give 8/28 is a movement that is taking place around Black Giving Day. Or it is another name for Black Giving Day. So we're looking at how do we create something to be able to do as Black Impact Houston also on that day. So stay tuned as we're developing that. On August 19th, we'll talk more about what that will look like. But are there any questions, any comments, thoughts? So one of the things
Brandy,
yes, Julia, go ahead.
Sorry. Just want to also add that if you have not joined the Facebook page, we have a Facebook group. Right now it's still called Greater Houston Black Nonprofits. We will be updating the name soon, but if you just Google, if you look on Facebook and do a search for Greater Houston Black Nonprofits, there are 3 questions, very basic questions you must answer in order to get into the group, but they're very basic, and I'm sure most of you on the call will meet them, but please join the Facebook group too to keep up with all the information that's coming out.
And Julia, I already typed it. I was just ready to press send. So the link is in the chat to join the Facebook group as well. So one of the things we do, part of our organization, is we make literacy fun, and we do that through cheers and chants and through songs and through, so Kelly knows this, and I'm going to end with this. And Kelly, I cannot tell you, every time I talk to Kelly, I have a pen and paper with me because this is her everyday conversation with her, just always information that is so useful and so helpful, and helped me grow as a leader. And I hope it helped you grow as a leader as well, and that you share this with your network. If you know any other Black leaders, I don't want this to be a secret society, as I know oftentimes that's what happens when we come with philanthropy and nonprofit work. So we usually say, one of the things we say is, you did a good job, so say you did a good job. You did a good job, so say you did a good job. You did a good job. You did a good job. GOODJOB. Good job. Good job. So thank you, Kelly. Thank all of you for spending this time with us today. We look forward to partnering with you, and we look forward to continuing to be Black, be bold, and be us. So if there's not anything else, we will be in touch with you. We look forward to working with you as we move into this new space. So thank you all. Y'all can unmute and say bye, like you said. And y'all can stick around.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Mhm.
Yes. We had 3
You're
Michelle.
recorded.